Welcome to Greyfriars Kirk. It's wonderful. It's always so wonderful to have people after such a long time when we've only had things online. And this is a very, very exciting evening, and it's wonderful to have so many people joining us online too, as this event tonight is being live streamed. And I know at least one person who's tuning in from Chicago, and I'm sure there are people from all over the place. So welcome, everyone. And it's really such a privilege tonight to welcome John Philip Newell to Greyfriars, to this iconic and historic church, and to have this opportunity to have a conversation about this absolutely wonderful book. I was actually, Philip got in touch with me and said, would we do this round about the time the book was published? And my wife and I were on holiday in Findhorn, and I was reading the book sitting in the sun in the village of Findhorn, thinking this is a wonderful book, and not realizing that a few hundred yards away, Philip and Ali were walking down the road right past where we were staying. And it was extraordinary that there was that kind of coincidence, but something of the resonance of this book has made quite an impact on me, and it's been wonderful to read it again. So tonight, we're going to have a bit of dialogue between John Philip and myself, but also some music and some dance. And that will be a really special part of this event tonight, part of this wonderful thing called Hebridean Treasure, which is based on some of the material that appears in this book from the Carmina Gadelica. So as we begin tonight, we're going to begin with some music from Mischa.
Yeah.
so much. It's wonderful. What a great way to start. This book has received a lot of praise, and I want just to read something that was written, a review of Philip's book, and it was nominated as one of the 20 best spiritual books of 2021. And it says this in the introduction: this is not just introducing us to an ancient spiritual path, the path of Celtic spirituality, but it's showing us its relevance to this time in our lives and this moment in history. And I think that's incredibly important because we are going through such trying and difficult times. But I'd like to begin by probing you a wee bit about this guy, Pelagius, who is one of the first characters that you talk about in the book. And I remember as a student at New College hearing about the Pelagian heresy, but I didn't know much about it. And I didn't know until I read your book that the guy was Welsh, that he was from this Celtic fringe, and that he was clearly some kind of disruptor. And he was someone who caused an awful stir. And Augustine wanted to ban him and certainly spoke out against some of his ideas. So I wonder if you could just enlighten us a wee bit about this character, Pelagius, because I think he's really quite intriguing. Guy with all the wrong hair, you know?
Yes, I could speak about Pelagius all night, but first of all, may I say how good it is to be here in dialogue with you, Richard, and in this company, and with people around the world, and with my team that I often refer to as some of the most talented young musicians and artists in Scotland. So I feel honored by your presence. Thank you. So yes, Pelagius, this 4th century monk, I believe he is probably the most misunderstood teacher of all time. And that misunderstanding continues in most of our Western Christian seminaries. I also studied at New College here in Edinburgh, as you know, Richard, and we were all required to write an essay comparing Pelagius with St. Augustine of Hippo. And it was known full well in advance who the hero was to be and who the villain was to be. And there were 4 misrepresentations, mistruths, spoken about Pelagius. We were told that there were no writings from his hand. We now know that there are many writings from the hands of Pelagius, and guess what? He was not saying what Augustine said he was saying. We tended to be told nothing about his nationality, so he was treated as a type of one-off heretic that could have come from anywhere in the universe. Guess what? He was one of us. He was a Celt. He was from Wales. And what he was teaching was not some odd idiosyncrasy. He was teaching what was being taught in the Celtic Christian tradition at that stage. And the third misrepresentation was we were told that he said that we didn't need grace, that we had some sort of capacity to save ourselves. Looking at his writings, it's very clear that he's saying we need the grace of forgiveness, we need the grace of love in order to get in touch with what is deepest in us, which is of God. But he didn't see grace as opposed to nature. He saw grace as given to reconnect us to our true nature, made of God. So right at the heart of Pelagius's teachings is that when we look into the face of a newborn child, we're looking into the face of God, freshly born among us. This is a truth that I think we know. I regard the births of my 4 children as the most sacred moments of my life. And I think that this is a deep knowing within us, that when we look into a newborn child's face, we are looking into the face of the divine. Pelagius was being criticized by Augustine, who wanted to say that what is deepest in us is opposed to God. And he was very much the father of the doctrine, which is called the doctrine of original sin, which wants to say that what is deepest in us is opposed to the sacred rather than of the sacred. This has enormous implications, this debate between Pelagius and Augustine. To say that what is deepest in us is of God is to say that the creativity of God is deep within us, this capacity to bring into being what does not yet exist, this capacity to live from love and from grace rather than essentially from selfishness, this capacity to embody expressions of the sacred. And Augustine had the backing of empire. So when Christianity got into bed with empire in the 4th century, there was some understanding that happened between power and religion. And it was really expected of religion, of imperial religion, that they should sanction the state. I mean, this is true of all empire, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire or the British Empire or the American Empire. Religion has done a lot to sanction the use of power by empire. And by empire, I'm meaning a nation that wants to exploit the earth and other nations, subordinate other nations for its own good, and is willing to exploit the resources of the earth for its own sake, rather than as cooperation with other nations around the sacredness of earth. So it ended up with Pelagius being, first of all, banned from the empire on a charge of disturbing the peace, and then excommunicated by the church doing what it was created as imperial religion to do, and that is support the state. And not only was Pelagius banned, but 10 years later, another ban was created to forbid anyone teaching Pelagius from coming within 100 miles of Rome. And then a number of years after that, anyone teaching Pelagius wisdom was banned from anywhere in Italy. And it's a debate that continues to happen within the Western Christian tradition. It has big, big implications.
There's a really interesting... I'm minister here at Greyfriars Kirk, and the National Covenant was signed here in 1638. And one of the things that it was saying that a lot of people don't realize was saying that we don't believe in the divine right of kings. In other words, we don't believe that the person that runs the empire is there because God put him there. And that goes back to the old clan system, where the clan chief, if he wasn't up to the job, was kicked out and somebody else would take his place. There wasn't this idea of the divine right of kings within that Celtic tradition. So I wonder, there was something of the politics of empire trying to hijack the freedom of the spirit going on, perhaps, and that there was a lot of politics around in that debate and that suppression of Pelagian ideas.
Yes, and so much of what Western Christianity has come to be characterized by or defined by was given articulation in the 4th century at the time of that sort of marriage between empire and church. One of the other articulations that happened in the 4th century that I think had enormous implications was the teaching a doctrine that was called creation ex nihilo, in which it was taught that a sort of transcendent God created matter out of nothing, ex nihilo. And the Celtic teachers say, but matter doesn't come out of nothing. It comes out of the very substance of God, which is to say this stuff, the stuff of the human body, is sacred stuff. The stuff of the body of the earth is sacred. So how we handle one another in relationship, how we care for the physical needs of those who are homeless, hungry, how we care for the matter of the body of the earth with reverence and justly. This was at the very core of Celtic vision. And that again made the Celtic teachers very inconvenient to empire, because what the empire and imperial religion really wanted to do was, in a sense, neutralize matter. It was fashioned out of nothing by God. And as soon as you neutralize matter, then you begin to think you can do whatever you wish to it. Yeah.
It's really interesting, this. I mean, reading this book last summer, I just got so much out of it, and I just really enjoyed it. But then revisiting it in the last week, in the light of everything that's happening in the world, there was something that just really struck a chord with me, and it relates very much to what you've just talked about. And it was in your chapter about George MacLeod, whom both of us, I mean, I didn't know him terribly well, but I did meet him a few times. And you obviously worked very closely with him. And there was something, you know, we've just been threatened with someone threatening to use nuclear weapons against the world because they're out of sorts, feeling miffed by the West. And this idea of, there's a wonderful quote that you have from George MacLeod saying that the material order is the garment of Christ. This is a way of articulating the idea of the incarnation, the idea that we are of the substance of the divine. And then he talks about the atom bomb today and the atomic threat. And everyone who knows anything about George MacLeod knows that regardless of anything that he was going to talk about in any speech, he'd always talk about banning nuclear weapons as an abomination even to possess them, let alone threaten to use them. But what he's talking about, which I think is really interesting, is the atomic threat to take God's body, to take God's blood, and enact a cosmic Golgotha. And it seems to me that what you're trying to revitalize in our thinking today is this idea that the atom of delight, which is the substance of what it is to be human, can be so readily turned into the atom of Golgotha. And I think that's just so incredibly important. I mean, do you want to maybe just expand a wee bit about some of that vision of George MacLeod and that understanding that he seemed to have of this notion of the divine infusing all of us?
So as some of you here may have known George, he was the founder of the modern-day Iona community in Scotland. And I came to know him as a young university student. And if you met George on the high street of Edinburgh or on a quiet pathway of Iona, you would not tend to get something like, hello, how are you today, or fine day. What you would tend to get from George MacLeod was, do you believe in nonviolence? And he would ask it so assertively that you felt terrified to disagree with him. I mean, he was possibly the most aggressive pacifist the modern world has known. So he was consumed by this passion for peace. And it was deeply rooted in his sense of the sacredness of matter and the sacredness that is at the heart of every human being. So he saw the non-violence of Jesus as an illumination into the basis of true relationship. To be in true relationship is not to dominate, it is not to violate, it is not to annihilate. So George passionately focused on that again and again and again. And whatever question he was asked, in a sense, his answer would come back to nonviolence, because he believed so much that was at the heart of the matter. I think that there are enormously radical implications to speaking of the essential sacredness of the matter of earth and of every human being. A number of years ago, I was giving a talk in California on some of these themes, and in attendance at the talk was a woman who had attended many of my talks before, but halfway through this one talk, I mean, the penny dropped. She suddenly saw the implications of the focus on the sacredness of all things. And she leaned to her neighbor, and meaning to whisper to her neighbor, but in fact it was audible to everyone in the room, she said, "He's a fucking radical." She came up to me at the end of the talk to apologize for her colorful language. And I said, "No, don't apologize. I mean, you got it. This is not just a spirituality to lead to sort of individual state of bliss or something, with a disregard for how we live in relation to one another and live in relation to the earth. This is a way of seeing that has radical implications for how we live and relate, how we view one another, even how we think about one another. There's a beautiful prayer in the chapter that we've based Hebridean Treasure, the live stage performance on. And it's a very simple line, but it says, "Bless to me my eyes, that I may bless everything that I see." So part of what this tradition is inviting us to do, I believe, is to be transformed even in how we think about one another, how we view one another, how we look at one another, as well as, of course, how we act in relation to one another. So part of what George MacLeod was inviting us into was not just nonviolence of action, but nonviolence of heart. And knowing that this has a power, this has an energy, this has a true strength to transform or to change, because no one can be forced into change. Change is relational, and it's about how we invite that desire for a true relationship, true interrelationship, to emerge from deep within. And from Pelagius right through to George MacLeod, the emphasis was not, I have truth, let me generously tell you what it is, which has been the style of sort of so much imperial religion. Sure. But rather, much more the sense that what is at the heart of you, what is at the heart of every human being is of the divine. So my role, our role in relation to one another is to release that, to set it free, to be liberators, rather than the tragic history of so much Christianity is about being conquerors.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the stories that I just love from the gospel is Jesus in Bethany, I think it is. No, Jericho. And he meets this guy who starts shouting out, and he's a blind beggar. And he starts shouting out to Jesus, and everyone tries to shut him up because, beggars kind of, lower the tone of the neighborhood, and they were all a bit embarrassed at this important visitor. And Jesus says to this guy who's blind and begging, "So what do you want me to do for you?" Which is a kind of simple, elementary question, but it's the question that most people with that imperial attitude never quite get round to asking, which is, what do you want, rather than saying, I know what's good for you. And my memory of my very first encounter with George MacLeod was when I was a probationer minister at St. Giles Cathedral, just round the corner. And he had been there, I think, as a probationer, like many years before. And he came up to me and he said, "So you're the probationer minister. Why are you not wearing a dog collar?" And then I discovered that he didn't wear a dog collar when he was a probationer there either. So there you go. But it's interesting. I mean, this kind of And Maxwell MacLeod, his son, has often talked about his dad as the most aggressive pacifist he'd ever met, you know. And there's something in, especially, I'd love you to talk a wee bit about St. Bridget, who features in the book, about this, you know, and maybe there's a thread running through what's happening in Russia at the moment of toxic masculinity, of this kind of ideas of the male dominance that is challenged by the sacred feminine, that is so resonant in the life and the story of St. Bridget and so many other people on that Celtic fringe. I wonder if you could maybe just explore for us a wee bit some of that, because I think it's just exactly what the world needs now.
Yes, St. Bridget, this 5th century Irish saint from Kildare. In the book, I explore her as an icon of the sacred feminine, of the face of the sacred feminine within us all. And part of what Bridget challenges in us, and challenges in so much of the Western world and other parts of the world today, is this shadow masculine energy that has gained dominance in so many parts of the world. And this shadow form of the masculine is very much power over or domination. And it's a form of energy that has arrayed itself up over against the earth and over against the feminine, and a demeaning, a subordinating of women. And these two often go hand in hand. I think that what we have done to the earth is again and again what we have often done to the feminine, to subordinate it, to dominate it, to exploit it. So Bridget is this very beautiful and sort of playful expression of the feminine, and the grace of the feminine to lead us into interrelationship rather than domination. And I think that the masculine, the shadow form of the masculine has so dominated both our religion and our culture, our nations, that we have, in a sense, forgotten what the divine masculine is. And I believe that it will only come back into clarity in our consciousness and in our lives to the extent that we come back into an honoring of the sacred feminine. That these two energies within us are given to dance, they're given to make love within us, both as individuals and as communities and nations. A number of years ago, in my researches, I came across an ancient prophecy from Iona. I haven't been able to date its strand historically, but it appears to be an ancient prophecy. And the prophecy states that just as the masculine face of the divine was shown to us clearly in the face of Jesus, the feminine face of the divine will come to us through Iona. And on that day, says the prophecy, the world will know peace. Now, I don't believe that this prophecy is to be limitedly or literally interpreted in terms of Iona exclusively or solely. But I do understand this prophecy because Iona, very much at the heart of much Celtic thought and Celtic celebration over the centuries, has been a place that has deeply honored the feminine. And until these two expressions of the divine in us sort of come back into harmony, there will not be peace. And I think that what we're seeing absolutely at the moment in the madness of Putin, and it's a madness that's reflected in many other political leaders. We've seen it on the other side of the Atlantic very, very clearly over past years. Is a madness that is driven to dominate and to dictate, rather than to know that the only true and sustainable way of relating is in interrelationship. But I don't believe that the sort of madness that we've seen in people like Trump and Putin and others is the deep spirit of this age. I think something else is trying to be born. And in a sense, the madness of that way of seeing, it's as if it knows its days are numbered. It is not the spirit of the future, because it has no future. It will self-destruct. So part of what we're being invited to live and to point to, I think, is what someone like Bridget embodies. And I think one of the very beautiful aspects of Bridget is she keeps inviting us to access the imagination. So to be made of God, I believe, is to be made of the imagination. It's to be made of the imaginal. Thomas Berry, the great eco-theologian, said, "The universe is so amazing, it must have been dreamt into being." And then he went on to say, and we are in such a mess, politically, ecologically, religiously, we're in such a mess, he said, that we need to dream the way forward. We need to allow ourselves to imagine ways of seeing, ways of being, ways of interrelating that we haven't known before. So Bridget is rising in our consciousness as these figures do when we most need them. And
just thinking about when you're talking about Iona and Bridget, you know, one of the sounds that you get on the coast is these oyster catchers. And I read somewhere once that this brood sound that they make is supposedly them saying, "Where's Bridget? Bring her back."
Yes.
I think this is a good moment to pause, because we're going to have some dance now from Kirsten and some music. And maybe, Philip, before we do that, you could just introduce it and say a little bit about this Hebridean Treasure.
Yes, yes. So Hebridean Treasure is this live stage performance that many of these musicians and dancer are part of. It's an attempt to tell the story of the spirituality of the Western Isles, both to speak of its beauty, of the way in which it celebrates the sacredness of the sun, the moon, the earth, of all life forms, but also to tell something of the story of the Highland clearances as a glimpse into what has happened again and again and again to native peoples and to native wisdom around the world. So the piece that Kirsten is going to dance celebrates the interrelatedness and, in a sense, the interwovenness of all things. In a lot of Celtic art, there's what is called the everlasting pattern, in which one strand is woven inseparably around another. You can't see where one begins and the other ends. And at the end of one curve, you might get an angelic face. At the end of another curve, you may get a human face. At the end of another strand, you'll get a creaturely face. And that, in a sense, is what Kirsten's dance does. She celebrates the glory of all life forms interrelated.
Wonderful. Thank you. What a talented family you have.
We call it a Newell von Trapp performance. If I could put in a plug for the performance, we haven't performed for a couple of years because of the pandemic, but we're about to perform live stage the entire piece next weekend in Findhorn at the Universal Hall, and it's going to be live streamed. So look it up on our website for details.
Yeah, that's one to definitely try and track down, because I saw some of this rehearsal for the larger thing the other day, and it's just fantastic. I want to talk to you a wee bit about this guy, John Muir, who is mentioned in the book. I went, after I was a probationer minister at St. Giles, I went to America for a year, and I worked as a minister in upstate New York, and my eldest brother came to visit, and we went hiking in the Grand Canyon and the Rocky Mountains. And that was the first time I'd ever come across John Muir. And we were in this bar that was almost like a shrine to John Muir. And I saw this quote from him. Apparently, when John Muir, this Scottish Presbyterian from Dunbar, saw the Grand Canyon for the first time, having almost shaken off his Presbyterian roots, but not quite, he looked down into this chasm and he said, "An ostentatious gesture even for God." which I think is just brilliant, you know. Yeah. Somehow, you know, you just can't quite shake off that Presbyterian dourness, you know. But there's something transformative that happened to John Muir when he discovered this space, and he discovered the landscape as his Bible. Tell us a wee bit more about this extraordinary Celtic character. Mm.
Yes, I in the book I refer to Muir as an American Celt. So he begins his life on this side of the Atlantic, but then journeys with his family to Wisconsin. I think that part of the greatness of Muir is, as you were touching on, he has this sense of creation being an immediate and ongoing flow of the divine. Early Celtic teachers, or Celtic teachers from very early on, keep returning to those words from St. John's Gospel, the words that begin the Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything has come into being through the Word, which is to say that everything essentially is an expression, an utterance of the One, a living utterance. I was using this this expression a couple of years ago in Virginia, giving a talk, And at the end of the talk, a gentleman came up and said, is there a connection between the word utter and the word uterus? And I said, my goodness, I think you're on to something. And I'm going to do my etymological research on this as soon as I can. And sure enough, the word utter, the English word utter, comes from the Middle English word utera, which is connected to the Latin uterus. So to say that everything is an utterance of God is to say that everything sort of come from the uterus or from the very womb of the divine. So John Muir had this sense of everything unfolding. And of course, he begins to formulate his thought around the time of Darwin's Origin of Species and this awareness that nothing is fixed, everything is unfolding. And if something stops unfolding, it's finished. So he has this sense of us and all things in this stream, in this sort of river of unfolding. And it's magnificent the way Muir can look at a landscape and, in a sense, can see its flow over thousands, millions of years. He can see that we're just in one part of its flow or unfolding. So he has the sense, like many of the Celtic teachers before him, of someone like Eriugena in the 9th century says God is speaking through two books. One is the little book, physically little, the book of Scripture. The other, he said, is the big book, the book of the cosmos, which is to see the earth as sacred text. It's to see every life form as a unique and unrepeatable utterance, expression. And someone like Eriugena in the 9th century wants to say we need to listen in stereo. I mean, that's not the word he uses in the 9th century, but he says we need to listen to these two, because if we listen only to the little book, the book of Scripture, he says, we're going to miss the vastness of the utterance and the unfolding of the utterance. And if we listen only to the big book, he says, and neglect the little book, we may miss the intimacy of the voice, because the small book, the book of Scripture, is very much concerns itself with how we are interrelating, how we are caring for the orphan, how we're feeding the hungry, and so on. So Muir comes in that line of realizing that there are two sacred texts. And I think one of his greatest contributions, and he can be considered, I believe, the greatest modern prophet of ecological consciousness, Muir. And I think among his greatest contributions to us is this sense that we need to keep falling in love with the earth, because that is what will fire the passion and sustain the passion for the hard work of change that we're being invited to be part of. So he says, return to the mountains. Keep returning to the mountains, not to necessarily stay in the mountains, but to allow the sort of juice of the divine, as he says, to be awakened within us again, and to know our interrelationship. And I think this is very much part of how do we sustain ecological radical change. And it seems to me if we don't keep falling in love and allowing ourselves to know and encounter and experience the sacred in earth, then our strength, our imagination, our passion will be diminished for the work.
I think one of John Muir's great quotes is that going out, and he used to go out on these colossal expeditions, sometimes just taking very minimal supplies with him. And he would say that going out was really a going in. And it leads me to sort of go back to something that you were talking about before, which is this idea of the imagination. And you introduce us to this extraordinary bloke that I knew almost nothing about until I read this book, Alexander John Scott. And it just seems to me from what you've described here that here was a guy who, like so many people, find themselves on the edge, find themselves shunned by the centers of power, but then becoming this fount of imaginative wisdom that fed generations of astonishing writers and people like George MacDonald or C.S. Lewis, and yet someone who was kind of shunned by the institutional church. What on earth is going on? I mean, it makes me quite worried, actually, as a Church of Scotland minister, that maybe I just need to kind of move out to the edge, you know? But I think there's something about this guy that seems really, really important, and about the relationship between his thinking and imagination and the creativity. And just inform us a wee bit about this chap, Scott.
Alexander John Scott is the person that I did my PhD on in Edinburgh, and he was a so-called heretic of the 19th century. He, as a young man, was unanimously deposed from the Church of Scotland ministry by the General Assembly of 1831 for teaching the essential sacredness of every human being and of the earth. And even his father was part of that assembly, and even his father voted against him. Scott was a great orator, and he influenced people personally, and those who heard him speak. He wasn't a writer. So there was hardly any material around for me to dig into on Scott. So in a sense, he was a perfect candidate for PhD research, because no one in the world knew anything about A.J. Scott. So after day 3, I was the world expert, and then consolidated my position for 3 years. But it was lovely old Alec Chain, the professor of ecclesiastical history at New College, a gracious, gentle man. He was the one that sort of pointed me to Scott, because Scott's name kept coming up in correspondence between people like Ruskin and Thackeray and Dickens and Chopin. And so my research took me, very interestingly, into personal letters rather than into formal publications. But also into the newspaper accounts of his heresy trials. And towards the end of the 3 years of doctoral research on Scott, I was having almost nightly conversations with him in my dreams. So I felt I came to know him well. But I would say in many ways that I have not written a page in my life. I have not uttered an address without being influenced by Alexander Scott, this little-known heretic of the 19th century. And I mean, he's influenced me in many ways. I think to be attentive to and to be alert to expressions of the divine everywhere, in every discipline, in every religion, in every culture. But also he was very emphatic about making the connection between spirituality and justice. So he was part of the beginnings of Christian socialism in the 19th century. That was really the first attempt to hold together a sense of devotion to the wisdom of Jesus with political action. But this final piece, the one that you've sort of picked up on, he is very much the one to say that to be made of God is to be made of imaginal energy. And he influenced these writers of the imagination like MacDonald, who then influenced Tolkien. So the imaginal, and that's part of what we were saying in the dance earlier, that the imaginal knows about the interrelationship, the interweaving of all things. But it also has this capacity to move us into what we do not yet know. And the challenges of this moment are so enormous that part of what we're being invited to do is to access this sacred imaginal dimension within us for how we are to be in relationship, how we are to be as a religion, how we are to be as a nation, how we are to be as an earth community. Let's allow ourselves to dream the way forward.
I'm really glad that it was just a delight actually when I was reading this to read the name Alec Chain and this idea that he was one of sufficient imagination of it. He was the most charming and wonderful lecturer. I mean, just the most amazing chap and a really gracious man. I had spent, before I came to New College, I'd spent 2 years living in Italy. And I used to go up quite often at weekends to this place called Bobbio in the Apennines, not far from where I was living. And I was really curious about this guy called Columbanus. And I thought, gosh, that sounds like Columba. And there was a monastery up there. And I was telling Alec Chain about it when I was at New College. And he came to see me. And he said, you know, we've got this travel scholarship thing. So it wasn't a PhD, but it was enough for me to buy my train ticket back to Italy to do some research into Columbanus. And that wonderful kind of ability to just have sufficient imagination to see that there's more to discover. And I did a little bit of research into Columbanus, this Celtic monk from Ireland, round about the time of Columba, who had traveled across Europe and founded monasteries in various places, including this wonderful monastery in Bobbio, which then largely disappeared.
Yeah, and I mean, as you'll know, St. Francis studied in Bobbio. So people often note the resonances between Franciscan awareness of the sacredness of the creatures and of all earth forms and the Celtic, and we can trace some of those influences to Bobbio. Yeah.
There's a bit of a theme about people who, you know, there's this notion that I think comes across very strongly in what you're writing about here, of the Celtic fringe, this people who were kind of, in a sense, shoved by Roman Empire and perhaps by Christian Empire further and further towards the Atlantic seaboard. And there's this theme of maybe people that don't quite always fit in, that are maybe disruptors. And there was this wonderful, in Toronto actually, in the early 1980s, this gathering of Celtic thinkers and writers, and this wonderful volume, which I got hold of recently, of the Celtic consciousness, which is absolutely amazing. It's an extraordinary collection of thinkers and writers and poets and what have you. But then there's this guy who, again, is someone that I just didn't know anything about, really. I mean, I should, but Kenneth White. Do you think there's something about prophets not being recognized in their own places, or?
Yes, absolutely. So Kenneth White, I discovered him maybe 15 years ago, and learned that he was a Scottish poet, and found that he was actually referring to people like Pelagius and Eriugena and Teilhard de Chardin from the French Celtic stream. In his poetry, these names would sometimes come up. So I was so fascinated, and I went to Waterston's and said, do you have anything by Kenneth White? And they said, who? And I said, well, he's a Scottish poet. And they said, oh, it'll be down in the Scottish poetry section. So I went down, nothing by Kenneth White down there, and went back to the desk and said, I can't find anything. And they said, well, look in the general poetry section. So I found one volume there by Kenneth White. But in France, he is celebrated as maybe the greatest English-speaking poet of the modern world. And I mean, that's a tragedy that Scotland has not celebrated this great poet. And I think he is part of a pattern, and that is a pattern of not being accepted in his home territory or not being honored. because nearly all of these great figures, these 9 chapters look at great figures over the centuries, nearly all of them have ended up being excommunicated, banned, charged for heresy, pushed out. So Kenneth White sort of fits that in the sense that he's a poet, a Scottish poet who hasn't been honoured in Scotland to the extent that I think he should be. But one of the reasons why I choose Kenneth as the last figure is because he is inviting us to journey into what he calls, towards what he calls the newfound land. And he uses the metaphor of Newfoundland as this new territory, and uses the St. Brendan figure, the voyager, and is really inviting us to set sail and to be open in our journeying to what we don't yet know. And one of the attractions for me in working with Kenneth White's work and having correspondence with him, he's based in Brittany, is because he doesn't have it figured out. You know, he doesn't, in a sense, know where that newfound land that we're all being invited into is. He's inviting us to just keep opening, and with a deep conviction that the deep resources of the sacred are within us if we keep opening to them.
I mean, it's really intriguing, that, isn't it? This, what you were referring to earlier about the possibility that that peace might emerge out of Iona. I mean, when you think about the state of the world at the moment and the complete redundancy of so many of the patterns that we keep repeating over and over again and keep failing to bring about peace or justice or a sense of our awareness of the sacredness of this land that we inhabit, it does seem to me that we are desperately in need of an alternative imagination. And maybe that alternative imagination has simply resided in that western coastline. It's interesting that you said, I didn't know that Kenneth lived in Brittany, but I remember Kate and I had a wonderful holiday in Brittany, and we got very friendly with this guy who we were living in his house. And he was the most Celtic Breton that you could possibly imagine. He looked like, you know, big moustache and fiercely Breton more than French. And he told us once that, you know, I think it was like only 10% of the people of France in 1870 actually spoke French. Most of them spoke. And his father had been the lighthouse keeper on the westernmost point of Brittany. And he was just a fiercely proud person. Anyway, we're coming to the end now, but there's one sort of question that I think relates to what I've just said there that I'd like to kind of probe you about. And that is that I've come across quite a few people in the Church of Scotland and in other places around, you know, theological discourse, if you like, who can be quite scathing about the idea that Celtic spirituality is a kind of contemporary invention. I think what you're trying to relate here is that there's a depth of wisdom and writing and insight that is far more extensive than we give it credit for. But I wonder, what do you say to those people, and we probably know and are probably friends with some of them, who can be quite scathing about the idea of Celtic spirituality? How would you sort of address that issue?
Yeah, an important question. Thanks for bringing it forward. I think one of the things that I would always want to say and to remember, and that is that some of these great early figures like Pelagius and Erigena and Bridget and so on, they would not have spoken of themselves as Celtic spirituality teachers. This is a modern term, but I think it's a modern term that we use to point to a very distinctive vision and way of seeing that we can trace from the earliest centuries right through to today. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book, is to trace this stream that keeps emerging through the centuries and keeps unfolding. I think one of the reasons why this tradition is not so much recognized as a theological tradition is because so many of these figures do not primarily speak in doctrinal or philosophical language. They speak rather in poetic language, which of course resists system. And I think one of the features of imperial Christianity from the 4th century right through to today is that we like our systems, and we like to know who's in and who's not in. We like to use terms like transcendence and immanence, whereas these great Celtic teachers, what they're teaching is radical immanence of the divine, but they would prefer to use words like the life within all life, the soul within all souls. And there's something, I mean, your description of this chap that you met in Brittany, I think that there's something in the Celtic stream that has always resisted being tamed. And I think one of the beautiful aspects of this tradition is that it remembers that to be made of God is to be made of wildness. It's to know that wildness within us. It's to know that depth that cannot be tamed. It cannot be domesticated. It cannot be named. And the sort of limited or frightened side of a lot of our Western tradition is try to do all those things, in a sense, domesticate the holy, in a sense, tame it or claim it as ours. Instead of being in awe of this subterranean flow of the divine in all things that can't be contained.
Yeah, gosh, you made me think of, I'm not sure if she's Celtic, but Annie Dillard, wonderful American nature writer, who says, people go to church with their Easter bonnets. They should be wearing crash helmets, she said. And we shouldn't be just raising tomatoes. We could be raising Lazarus. And I think there's something really important about that. And anyway, I think we're going to have some music now. But I just want to say to everyone, we're also going to be having a glass of wine. So apologies to those of you who are watching online, because you'll have to just pour your own glass of wine. But the rest of us who are here are going to enjoy this. But this has been a real joy tonight. The music and the dance has been fantastic. This is such an important book. As I've read it for the second time, I realized that this is wisdom for this really wonderful, it's a really challenging time that we're living in. I think a lot of people feel the weight of what we're living under just now. And this is something on the fringe that could become something that would inform wisdom for the future. So thank you for this, John Philip. And thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to conclude with some more music, and then those of you who are here, stay and have some wine. But thank you all so much.
Thank you,
John Philip.
Thank you. Thank you.